They were small. They were economical.
Ready to go long distances on a gallon of gas.
And unlike the last top 10 list I did, these cars had many fans, as you showed by sending in your suggestions for this list.
What have you got to say for yourself? It's a Corolla!
In fact, a couple cars on this best list were on my worst list too. Here are the top 10 best subcompact cars, as chosen by you. After I released my first top 10 list for this channel a few weeks ago on the worst subcompact cars,
Crap.
I expected I would get comments from viewers that disagreed with some of the picks, but I didn't expect so many people were so passionate about these little cars and offended by their inclusion on that list. In most cases, they were from viewers outside of North America, where some of these cars had much better reputations. Some of the most vocal responses, if they already didn't make the top 10, will be included as honorable mentions. Also, although I've avoided episodes on my channel on models that are still in production, I am not following that rule for this list, since some of the cars on this list are still in production in part because of how great they were, and still are. My Old Car is now on Instagram. Follow me at MyOldCar1981 to send suggestions for future episodes, and use the hashtag MyOldCar1981 to share photos of your old car. Number 10. Volkswagen Beetle. Earlier this year I did an episode on the Volkswagen New Beetle, and despite its initial popularity when it debuted in 1997, it would never come close to the legacy of the car it tried to replace. Production of the original Beetle, which for the most part was unchanged since 1938, was still active in Mexico and Brazil when the new Beetle development started in the early 90s. Sales of the original Beetle ended in the United States in 1977, not just because of outside competition,
Ever wish you owned a Volkswagen?
but maybe even more so from within Volkswagen, thanks to a car that is also on this list, the Mark I Golf, which was marketed as the Rabbit in the US. But although the Beetle had lost some appeal in the US and Europe, it gained popularity in Mexico and South America for its simple and reliable design, and parts from millions of Beetles sold before to help keep them on the road. It also spawned an equally iconic design, the VW Bus, which has since become synonymous with the 1960s, even more so than the Beetle. Recently, VW has announced production to be starting soon on its electric ID Buzz, which clearly used the original bus as inspiration. But for many, nothing can replace the original bus, nor the Beetle, that still holds the record for most sales of any car in history. Number 9. Ford Fiesta. Since the majority of my channel's viewers are from the US and Canada, when you mention the Ford Fiesta, some may only know of the last Fiestas sold here, the Mark VI generation, which was imported here between 2008 and 2019. But some older viewers on this side of the Atlantic may recall the Mark I Fiesta, which was imported between 1977 and 1980. Development of the Mark I began in 1972, with a then more rare feature of having front-wheel drive and a transversely mounted engine. With a length of 140 inches, it was dwarfed by the American-made land yachts of the late 70s, many of which were sold by Ford as well. US spec Mark I Fiestas were built in Germany and had to meet stricter emission standards, more energy-absorbing bumpers, as well as a luxury nearly everyone in the US wanted, air conditioning.
I like it, Clark.
So do I, Lois.
A feature not offered on the same car sold in Europe.
Sir, your cape is showing!
To help curb the cost of continuous imports, Ford planned to replace the Fiesta with the Mark III version of the European Ford Escort. However, what the US and Canada got in 1981 ended up being changed so much to meet American requirements that it bore little resemblance to the so-called world car it was intended to be. However, in 2008, it was now part of the One Ford strategy to have the same car sold globally to improve efficiency and overall cost. As it continued into the 2010s, the Fiesta may not have lasted as long as it did if it wasn't for the introduction of the ST model, which became a big hit for the hot hatch crowd. But ultimately, the Fiesta wasn't a crossover, and was sacrificed by Ford's marketing decision to focus almost all American sales on crossovers, trucks, and SUVs. Number 8. Hyundai Excel. This same car was also on my list of top 10 worst subcompacts. So how did it also end up as a top 10 best? I suspect it comes down to the home country of its owners. In the United States, the Excel was Hyundai's first model sold there, so most Americans had no idea of their history.
Hyundai. Cars. It makes sense.
Initially, it sold very well, setting a sales record for a first-year import with over 168,000 sales in 1985, most likely due to the starting price of under $5,000 US. But in South America, Hyundai had already been selling a model called the Pony since 1975, and imports to some European countries began in 1979.
The Hyundai Pony.
And for those of you who commented in my last top 10 episode that the Pony was a different car than the Excel, and I implied that they were the same, thank you for pointing that out. You are correct. So this may be why the Excel was more appreciated by some, since they knew it was a significant step up from the Pony. US buyers didn't have the Pony to compare it to, and maybe Americans simply demanded too much for such a low price. Either way, if it wasn't for the Excel, Hyundai and partner Kia wouldn't be the successes they are today. Number 7. Honda CRX. Thanks to the strong reputation Honda had been getting in the United States since the introduction of the Civic in 1972, Honda expanded the Civic lineup when its third generation began in 1983 for the 1984 model year by offering the CRX, essentially a shorter two-seater version of the Civic. Although both the Civic and CRX each offered economy and sport-themed models.
This is Rhonda, the happy owner of a Honda Civic CRX.
The CRX had the more sporty look, with its sport-back design, which didn't have to allow enough headroom for rear seat passengers, since there was no rear seat. You could still get the base 1.3-liter 4 that made 58 horsepower, which although may sound slow, it wasn't all that bad for a car that weighed under 1,900 pounds, or well under 900 kilograms. In 1985, the SI model was offered with a 1.5-liter 4 that nearly doubled the horsepower, and all that power rode on just 13-inch diameter wheels.
It's a rocket.
The second-gen model started in 1987, which of course made it bigger, heavier, and more powerful, followed by its replacement with the Del Sol model in 1992, which many consider to be the third-gen CRX. But the two-seater market was shrinking fast, and the Del Sol's lack of a hatchback made it even less practical than the CRX, leading to its end by 1998. Number 6. Honda Civic. Considering that the CRX made this list, it goes without saying that the car which helped make the CRX a reality would have to be on this list too. The Honda Civic began in 1972, replacing the two-cylinder N600, and proved early on to be a serious competitor to American compacts like the Chevy Vega and Ford Pinto, neither of which could compete in terms of reliability and quality for the price. American automakers were still relying on sales of large, and some very large, sedans, and Honda came to the market just at the right time, the start of the US oil crisis. By 1975, Civics were badged and sometimes referred to as CVCC, which stood for Compound Vortex Controlled Combustion. This design dates back to 1971, which, when incorporated into Honda's existing engines, provided a more lean mixture of fuel and air, which in turn lowered carbon monoxide emissions, eliminating the need for a catalytic converter.
The new Honda Civic GL. We make it simple.
Jab that till it hoits 500 times without stopping, you hear me?
The Civic would continue to be a market leader in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s.
It has 795,265 miles.
And although the popularity of fuel-efficient and more practical crossovers would start to dominate the US market in the 2010s, the 10th generation Civic that began in 2015 was the first design to be sold globally, such that both Europe and the US shared the same car, whereas Europe used to get its own version. An 11th generation began in 2021, looking positively huge when parked next to a first-gen model, and is now only available as a four-door liftback, a design which gives it at least some chance to compete with crossovers. Time will only tell how long the Civic can survive, but the fact that it is still here today is a true testament to the car's popularity and legacy. Number 5. Geo Metro. This one admittedly was a surprise to me that so many love this car to get on this top 10 best subcompact list. Although it made it into the top 10 worst list due to the votes it got from viewers, I suspect some of those votes were from people who never owned one. I tended to agree with the low opinion, but I think it's because at the time, like many car lovers of the 80s and 90s, I simply felt small economy cars weren't cool, and were certainly nothing to aspire to.
Getting to know you.
But I tend to forget that the vast majority of people on the road don't love cars. They drive them out of necessity. And when a car like the Metro comes along that gives them simple, reliable transportation, they appreciate it more than I would. The Metro was essentially a rebadge of the Suzuki Swift, which Suzuki also sold in the US.
There's two giant Suzukis.
There are 3 giant Suzukis.
And it was called the Cultus in Japan. Canadian buyers knew it as the Pontiac Firefly, and the previous generation Swift, before the start of the Geo brand, was sold as the Chevrolet Sprint. Its Japanese reliability made it a strong competitor to the previously mentioned Honda Civic, and although I still think the two-seater convertible Metro was probably not the best idea, any well-preserved Metro today could potentially sell for more than the car did new, and could potentially be the star of any car show. Number 4. Toyota Corolla. Toyota got a jump on the American subcompact market before Honda, with the launch of the first generation Corolla in 1966. Designed for Japanese roads, where low displacement was the norm, thanks to taxes Japan imposed on higher displacement models, the original Corolla was expected to displace less than 1 liter, but was expanded to 1,077 cubic centimeters, not quite 1.1 liters, but enough to compete with the soon-to-be released Datsun 1000. American market cars were also offered with a 1.2 liter and sold as low as $1,700 US. The Corolla would continue to be a bestseller for Toyota through the 1980s,
And look, I got this fabulous new interior.
leading to a partnership with General Motors to sell a rebadged version as the Chevy Nova in 1985, and the Geo Prism in 1989. Although that partnership with GM was over by 2009, the Corolla continued to be a mainstay in Toyota's lineup, now in its 12th generation that began in 2018. Of course, thanks to the crossover craze in the US, Toyota also sells a crossover called the Corolla Cross, a clear example of putting a tried and true name on a model people want today. And I suspect that it may eventually be the only Corolla that Toyota will sell in the US, but it was an amazing run nonetheless. Number 3. Mazda 323. Although it was first introduced in Japan as the Familia in 1963, American buyers knew it as the GLC when imports began in 1977. GLC stood for Great Little Car, and Mazda took a 1960s song called Spanish Flea and changed the lyrics
I love my great little car, Mazda's great little car,
to become the ad jingle for the GLC. The ads for the GLC, like all subcompacts of the 70s, heavily pushed the car's high fuel economy, but they also made it clear it was a piston engine, to set it apart from other Mazda models that had been on the market with far less efficient rotary engines. By 1985, and 2 generations later, the GLC name was dropped for the more common global name of 323.
The guys at Mazda lent me this 323 for her to drive. She knew right away it wasn't just another small car.
Ford's partnership with Mazda helped introduce a variation of the 323 as the Mercury Tracer, as well as the Ford Laser in Australia. By 1989, Mazda introduced the Protege name on the sedan model for the US, and by 1994, now in its 8th generation, Canadians would know it as the Neo. More performance-themed models arrived by the early 2000s, now called the Mazda Speed Protege, as well as the Protege 5 wagon model. Although the 323 name still carried on in some markets, in America, Mazda moved to single-digit numbers for the model names, and the 323 simply became the 3 in 2003. The 3 would become one of Mazda's best sellers. That is, of course, until the crossover craze took over, but many fans of Mazda still remember it as the 323. Number 2. Toyota Tercel. I was working on my earlier episode about the Tercel when I was also asking for votes for the worst subcompact car, and it became clear in my research that many people could more likely vote for the Tercel as one of the best, which led me to open up voting for this top 10 best list.
Tercel!
Yes, the Tercel was sometimes referred to as a turd cell, but not enough to make the top 10 worst list. The Tercel was a smaller and cheaper alternative to the Corolla, and unlike the Corolla, the Tercel was a front-wheel drive car from the start.
This front-wheel drive Tercel will get you where you're going with more room inside than any other subcompact.
And in fact, it was the first front-wheel drive Toyota when it debuted in 1978. Although those who prefer cars for their fun-to-drive qualities typically prefer a rear-wheel drive, for the masses of people who just need reliable transportation that can safely get them through snow and rain, the Tercel had an advantage, so much so that Toyota started to transition the Corolla to front-wheel drive by 1983. The Corolla name was also attached to the Tercel in its first few years, despite the two cars being very different, but eventually the Tercel gained enough of a following that it dropped the Corolla prefix. But by the early 2000s, even though it had grown in size to take over the market left behind by the larger Corolla, sales had dipped enough to lead to an all-new replacement, the Echo, a car which never came close to the sales its predecessor once did. Today, the Tercel, especially in four-wheel drive wagon version, are a favorite for car collectors, including fans of the TV show Breaking Bad, which helped make this car a celebrity.
New car? Yeah, I'm guessing this one doesn't bounce.
Before I announce the number 1 subcompact car, here are a few honorable mentions. The Chevy Chevette. Yes, this car also made the top 10 worst list, but it had its fans as well, and many loved it for what it was and didn't expect anything more. It was my first car as well, and as a result, it meant a lot to me too.
And why would you spend $89 on stripes?
The devil made me do it.
Oh.
Renault Le Car. Yet another one that made the top 10 worst, but many in Europe who knew it as the Renault 5 found it to be a great little car there, and figure most Americans simply didn't understand it, or weren't willing to accept some of its quirks that made it such a popular French car. The Shogun. Based on a car that almost made the top 10 worst list, it was a heavily modified Ford Festiva with a Taurus SHO 3-liter V6 that could only fit where the Festiva's back seat once was. At a cost of $42,000 each, only 7 of these cars were ever built. Only 6 survive today, as sadly, one of them was lost in a Colorado wildfire at the end of 2021. Number 1. Volkswagen Golf. If you know anything about the history of compact cars, you had to know this car would be on this list. The Mark I Golf was launched in Germany in 1974. Intended to be the replacement for the number 10 model on this list, the Beetle, which would continue to be built in Mexico and Brazil. By 1976, the GTI model was introduced with a fuel-injected 1.6-liter 4 that could get the car up to 180 kilometers per hour. Volkswagen exported it to the United States and Canada, where it was renamed the Rabbit, primarily due to the fact that VW figured buyers on the other side of the pond would be turned off by a car named after a sport for the rich, not those who needed a small economical car. Volkswagen even opened an assembly plant in the US to build the Rabbit, becoming just the second non-American auto company to build cars in the US, with the first being Rolls-Royce back in the 1920s. However, by the introduction of the Golf Mark II in 1983, Volkswagen dropped the Rabbit name in favor of keeping the same name worldwide, and faced stiff competition from the Japanese. The Mark II Golf would be the last Golf to be built in the US, with the Mark III becoming a US import in 1994. The Mark III also introduced an option for the Golf as an estate model, or as Americans would call a station wagon. The Golf remained for sale in the US through the 2000s, even being renamed to the Rabbit between 2006 and 2008. Today the Golf is in its 8th generation, with hybrid versions now becoming more commonplace as Volkswagen distances itself from its Dieselgate past. The all-electric e-Golf ended production in 2020 due to strong competition, but I wouldn't be surprised if someday the Golf comes back as only being an electric vehicle. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.
If this were presented to me today as a brand new car, I would wet myself.